This video is brought to you by the University Writing Center, a unit of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. You can contact us at uwc.utexas.edu.
How's it going, Mac?
Going all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. So you ready to talk about directly quoting and paraphrasing?
Let's do it.
To begin, as we do, we'll start with Jodie Nicotra's definitions of paraphrase and quotation from Becoming Rhetorical. And she says that you should paraphrase when you're including facts, data, and statistics, when you want to preserve your own prose style rather than gumming it up with other people's words, or when you're trying to include only the most pertinent information from a source. By contrast, Nicotra says that you should directly quote when you want to capture how someone said something, whether it's something controversial or memorable, when you're about to analyze a difficult concept, or when you're introducing a word that's unique or important to your argument. And at the end of the section, she offers a couple of pieces of advice. She notes that writing effectively often involves mixing quotation and paraphrase along with summary. And Nicotra recommends that you should always introduce your quotations. You can't just plop them in your composition willy-nilly, she writes. So now that we have some definitions and some concepts to work with, I thought I'd start by asking you how you approach quoting and paraphrasing in your own writing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if I'm being honest, for too long I approached it sort of retroactively, which was you'd more or less write the paper that you're ready to submit. You realized or you remembered that you needed 2 or 3 quotes or citations or whatever it was. And then you look for those sentences, decontextualize it, you can kind of drop into an argument that you already have. I think that I can acknowledge that I used to do it that way probably too often. Ideally, though, the way I try to do it now, the way I approach it, is that as you're drafting, as you're trying to put your product together, you're reading a lot of the work, a lot of the scholarship, the articles, whatever it is you're drawing on. And as you're doing that, you're identifying the concepts, the phrases, the ideas that you really want to incorporate into your own argument, that you want to build your own argument with.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you can kind of think of quotation, or I try to think of it as what's that concept, what's that term, what's that specific thing, that point that you really want to incorporate into your own thing, your own writing. And then you can kind of work backwards sometimes. So for me, I think of what do I really need in my own argument that I can draw on. So that's a quotation. And then from there you go, all right, I need to talk about the specific concept or word. Well, I need to contextualize it. So odds are you're going to need to give the reader sort of a big picture overview of what that project is so they know how to make sense of it, so they know how you're making sense of it.
I find myself swinging too far in the other direction, right? So I'm an oversighter now. I'm an over quoter. My first draft paragraphs tend to be, 90% quotations, and then my second draft is going back and figuring out then what am I trying to say out of these, what's the argument that I'm trying to make here, by including those quotations.
I think that totally makes sense though as a first draft, because if you've been reading those projects, you understand the context that they came from. You understand the writer's project. So it makes sense that that's sort of what you focus on when you're trying to pull in the most important things to build your own argument. But when we realize or remember that, hey, we're writing for an audience, for a reader, that's when you go, these quotes are good, but I actually need to situate it. I need to contextualize it a little bit better, which is then gets you into summary and paraphrase to kind of get you to that point, to that quotation that is so important.
Well, I think you're previewing our next question, I think. So what are the effects that quoting and paraphrasing have for the reader? Then how do they help the reader?
Well, like you were saying, I think if you overdo quotation, it can feel, it's kind of a lot for the reader to make sense of, where they go, what are you actually arguing here? You need to enter the conversation enough your own for them to feel like your argument is worth reading in the first place. Yeah. So I think that if you overdo it, it can kind of drown out what you're actually saying.
That gives us some ideas about why you should quote. Well, what about with paraphrasing? I mean, you mentioned it as a way of giving additional context, and that it sort of fits this, it occupies this kind of middle ground between the specificity of the quote versus the 500-foot of summary.
Yeah.
What about, what effects do you think a well-written paraphrase has for the reader, I suppose?
Paraphrase is tough.
Yeah.
That's one of the ones that when I'm writing, I still go, oh, am I paraphrasing this right? So it's not always as simple, like you either get it or you don't on your end. I think that probably since junior high, maybe every year, every English or writing class, we've been told paraphrase is putting the text in your own words.
Yeah.
But if you do it wrong, you're a cheater and you're stealing or whatever it is. So it's so fraught, right? So for me, the problem is that putting it in your own words is good advice if you know how to make sense of that. But it's hard for people too.
Yeah, it's one that I feel like I wrestle with all the way to the final draft, right? Like even when I have my, argument firmly in place, the thing I'm looking at or where I'm focusing then is, okay, well, have I actually framed this quotation or this idea the way that I want to frame it so that it actually advances my argument or advances the claim I'm making? And you're anticipating, again, the next question I want to ask, which is what advice would you give to writers who want to learn to quote and paraphrase more effectively?
I think for me, before you really start writing anything, look and see what projects interest you, what articles or books, whatever it is, your sources basically, and say, what are some things I can incorporate? For me, the best way to understand quotation and paraphrase too, by extension, is to really build your argument through other people's work. What's interesting? What do you need to talk about to make your argument? And once you do that, you can start to realize, oh, okay, to use this concept or this specific phrase, I need to contextualize it. I need to situate it for the reader. All right, well, what's the project? I need to give a couple big picture summary overview. Okay, well, how do I get from the big picture to that small, the specific picture? Well, I need to show how it makes sense. How does the specific concept fit within that larger project, which is, to me, one way of understanding paraphrase.
No, I like what you're saying about, trying to build your argument through your sources and practice. What about in terms of practicing at that, because I was thinking that's one of those where you mentioned earlier that we're told that we need to do it, but we're sort of told, okay, just put it in your own words, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean? So, yeah, and I was thinking in terms of strategies as well. One that worked for me was learning to read not just for the content of what I'm looking for, so getting all those sources together, but not just looking for the content, but looking for models, right? Like looking for, Nicotra talks about those signal phrases, and she gives a few, right? According to X, or as X says, X writes, but there are a million of them. There are a million ways to frame those quotations, so one thing I try to do is actually I keep I'll copy and paste into a Google Doc that I have just interesting ways of phrasing things, right? Interesting ways of framing ideas, whenever I encounter something cool, like that.
I think for me, it's common advice, which is read it and then write your paraphrase or your summary without looking back at it.
Yeah.
Sort of read it once, do you make sense of it, fine, and then write without referring back and forth to the text, just to see what happens. Now, I'm also, I think, cynical of that because I have so much experience of being down to the wire and going, I don't have time to do that.
Another strategy that I think is really useful, which is annotating your reading as you go, right? So how does that play into your efforts to paraphrase and quote, fairly and effectively, I guess?
I think it's huge. I think for me, when I'm writing or reading something, I'm always looking for, oh, that's an interesting phrase, or oh, that's something that I could draw on, or that's something at the very least I can circle back to. So when you're doing that sort of research work, ideally you sort of have an archive that you can circle back to and go, all right, when it's time to actually draft, go, what are some ideas that I can pull from?
So, if we wanted to sum up what advice we would give to writers who were trying to learn to paraphrase better, or paraphrase and quote more effectively, try to build your argument through your sources rather than retrofitting them. try writing the paraphrase. Not just putting it in your own words, but trying to summarize the concepts that stand out to you the most, and yeah, trying to write those concepts without looking back at the text later. And what else?
No, I think that that makes total sense. For me, I say this all the time, but it's really about, it's not simply giving yourself enough time to do it, because I think even sometimes that makes it seem like, oh, I'm supposed to start 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week or whatever before it's due. I mean, that's better than working on it the night before. But if you do procrastinate, which happens to everybody, you also can't be surprised if it does feel difficult.
So, any last remarks about paraphrase or quotation?
This stuff's hard. If it's presented as easy, it's not.
Yeah, that's one thing I appreciate about our department is that in the way we teach 306 is kind of normalizing that writing is difficult and it takes practice.
Yeah.
And and I think that's okay. A lot of people feel like if they don't get it right on the first draft, they're not a good writer. And these are things that you and we've been studying this stuff forever, and we still have to work at it.
It's easy to sort of talk about these things as if they're simple because they are so elemental. And you don't want to say it'd be, if you're a baseball player, you don't want to be like, I don't know how to throw, or it's tough for me to throw a ball or whatever. But this stuff's difficult, and I think that it makes sense to acknowledge that, because that just sort of makes the work of it more transparent.
All right. Well, I thought this was very productive. Thank you for talking to me today.
No problem. No, happy to do it.